I, Aldrich Vane, Duke of Thornmere, have never been a man who lost things. I lost my father at 17, but that was not losing so much as inheriting the wreckage he left, the encumbered land, the unpaid creditors, the lesson written in his ruin. That sentiment was simply another word for poor management. I lost my mother at 11, but I have no clear memory of that, only the shape her absence made in the house, which I eventually learned to navigate without noticing. I have not lost a legal dispute, a property negotiation, or a tenancy review in 20 years of active stewardship. I have a reputation in 3 counties for precision, for fairness, and for a quality of emotional remove that my tenants call steadiness and my solicitors call, in private, something considerably less flattering. What I am telling you is this. I am a man who keeps things in their place, and I have kept everything in its place for a very long time, and the single exception to this record, the one variable I could not contain, could not administer, could not manage at the precise and comfortable distance I required, arrived in my house at 13 years old in a black mourning dress with her father's ledger under her arm, and did not leave until I sent her away. I sent her away on a Tuesday in March. I have thought about that Tuesday every day for 3 years. Her name was Sarah Vane. Her father was Charles Vane, who served for 11 years as the Thornmere estate solicitor, an arrangement that suited us both admirably, as Charles was methodical, honest, and entirely devoid of the quality of requiring conversation when there was nothing to say. He died of a lung complaint in October, which left behind a rented house in Aldwycon village, £17 in ready money, and his daughter, who was 13 and had, as far as I could determine, no one else in the world who was practically obligated to do anything about it. I had a distant cousin in Harrogate who had been mentioned as a possibility. She came to the house, looked at the child, and said something about the east wing being drafty and the situation being irregular. I showed her out myself, which I have never done before or since for a house guest, and told my housekeeper, Mrs. Dunlop, to have the east wing rooms prepared, as Miss Vane would be staying. Mrs. Dunlop, who had worked at Thornmere for 30 years and had formed opinions about everything in it, said simply, "Yes, Your Grace," in the tone she reserved for decisions she had already made before I made them. Sarah Vane moved into the east wing on a Thursday. She brought 2 trunks, the ledger, and a small watercolor of the moors that had hung in her father's study. She installed the watercolor on the wall beside the east window before she unpacked anything else. I know this because Mrs. Dunlop told me, and Mrs. Dunlop told me because she had already begun the project, which she would pursue for the next 6 years, of ensuring that I paid attention. I did not speak to the child for the first 4 days. I was not being unkind. I was giving her time to settle, which seemed to me a reasonable and generous thing to do. On the 5th day she appeared in the doorway of my study at 10:30 in the morning and said, without preamble, that she had been through the household inventory that Mrs. Dunlop had set aside for filing, and she had found what she thought was an error in the 1841 timber account. She held up the ledger, her father's, which she had apparently been reading. I looked at her. She had dark eyes and her father's quality of stating things without inflection, as though the fact itself was sufficient, and any emotional coloring would only obscure it. "Come in," I said. She came in. She put the ledger on my desk and pointed to the line in question. She was right about the error. It was a transposition, a small one, but in a timber account not trivial. I said so. She said she thought it might go back further, possibly to the previous quarter, and had I a pen. I gave her a pen. She sat down across from me, without being invited, and began going through the ledger. We worked in that study for 2 hours. When she was done, she had found 3 additional errors, all minor, and had arranged the correct figures in a small neat column in the margin. She closed the ledger, stood up, returned the pen to the holder on my desk and said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and left. I sat in my study for some time after she had gone. This was how it began. I arranged for her education with the same attention I gave to any significant estate matter. A governess from Harrogate for the first 2 years, then a more serious arrangement with a teacher's college in Richmond, a weekly tutor in French, in music, in natural history and composition. I arranged for her to have access to the library, which was the largest room in the house and contained 4,000 volumes, none of which she seemed intimidated by. I arranged for a subscription to the lending library in the village, which supplemented the 4,000 volumes when she had exhausted whatever section currently interested her. She was, without question, the most naturally curious person I have ever encountered. Not in the dilettante sense, she did not accumulate interests as decoration. She pursued things. She would read 2 books on drainage theory and then go out to the south field in her walking boots to look at the actual drains, and come back with observations that were, frequently, correct. She would learn 12 French verbs and then ask Mrs. Dunlop about the French word for whatever Mrs. Dunlop was doing in the kitchen, because she wanted to hear it spoken. She would find something in a natural history and bring it to me, not to impress me, I understood fairly quickly, but because she had found something interesting and sharing it seemed to her a natural response to finding interesting things, the way most people would share food. I was not, by nature, a man who shared things. My father had been effusive, loud with his enthusiasms, generous to the point of carelessness, warm in the manner of men who have never had to be careful about anything. I had spent my adult life being careful. I did not tell people things they had not asked. I did not offer opinions in rooms where my opinion had not been requested. I ran the estates. I attended to my tenants' needs. I discharged my obligations to the county and the title, and I did all of this from behind a wall that I had built so gradually and maintained so consistently that I had long since stopped noticing it was there. Sira Vane noticed it immediately and treated it as a feature of the terrain, like a style in a field, something to note, to navigate around when necessary, and occasionally to climb over if the view warranted it. The first time she climbed over it, she was 15. I had returned from a 3-week trip to London to deal with a property dispute, and I came back to find the tenant families in the West Fields had submitted a petition, organized, neatly written, entirely respectful, regarding the state of the field drainage after the autumn rains. The petition had been composed, I learned from Mrs. Dunlop with very little surprise, by Miss Vane, who had visited each family during my absence, recorded their specific concerns, and presented them in the form most likely to result in action. I called her into my study. I told her that she had overstepped. I told her that my tenants' concerns were addressed through proper channels and that she was not a proper channel. I was not unkind, but I was, I will admit, rather cold about it. She listened to all of this with her hands in her lap and her eyes on my face. When I finished, she said, "The Harker family's youngest has been coughing since October. Mrs. Harker believes it's the damp from the field. I thought that was worth knowing." I said nothing. She said, "I'm sorry for the overreach. I'll be more careful." She stood, and then she paused at the door and said, "The drainage on the south field needs looking at as well when you have time," and left. I sent a crew to the West Fields the following week. I also sent one to the South Field. I did not tell her this. She did not mention it. But when I came back from inspecting the work 3 weeks later, she looked up from her book in the library and said, without preamble, "The Harker child is better." "Good," I said, and sat down, and opened the Hull accounts, and we spent the evening in the same room without speaking further, which was, I realized, somewhere around 9 o'clock, the most comfortable I had been in a very long time. This is the thing about Sira Vane, and the thing I did not understand until it was far too late to be useful. She did not require anything of me. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. Every person I have known in my adult life has required something of me. My tenants required fairness and attention. My solicitors required decisions. My few social acquaintances required the performance of collegial warmth. Even my housekeeper required, in her quiet and entirely justified way, that I acknowledge the existence of the household she ran. All of this was fine. This was the appropriate shape of obligations, and I discharged them. But Sira Vane did not require me to be warmer than I was, or more talkative, or more demonstrably present. She did not require that I explain myself or justify my silences or fill the air between us with anything it didn't need. She sat in my library and read. She brought me things she found interesting. When I was cold, she adjusted, and when I was available, she was simply there, and neither state seemed to disturb her equilibrium in the least. What I did not understand, what I could not understand because I had never encountered it before, was that this was not indifference. She was not incurious about me. She was not distant. She simply did not require me to be a version of myself that I wasn't, which meant that in her company I had no particular reason to maintain the version of myself I had spent 20 years constructing. And so, by degrees so gradual I did not notice them happening, I stopped maintaining it. By the time she was 16, I was reading in the library in the evenings rather than my study, because she was there, and the quality of the silence in a room with her in it was different from the quality of silence in an empty room, and I preferred it without for some time, examining why. By the time she was 17, I had developed the habit of bringing things to her attention, a particularly dense passage in a book that I found useful, a development in the Hull shipping accounts that had an interesting resolution, an observation about the moor in winter that she would have walked by that morning, and that I had noticed from the carriage. This was not something I had done with anyone. It did not occur to me to examine it. By the time she was 18, Peel, my secretary, had twice entered the library when I was in the middle of telling her something, and I had not immediately stopped telling it, which Peel registered with the expression he reserved for developments that required him to revise a working assumption. By the time she was 19, I understood with a clarity that arrived without warning one evening in February, while she was reading a natural history of the North Yorkshire moors, and I was watching her turn a page, that I had entirely, silently, and without any adequate defense, allowed her to become the most necessary person in my world. I put down the paper I was holding and went to my study and closed the door, and sat in the dark for some time. My father had loved my mother with the kind of completeness that leaves no margin for anything else. I knew this the way you know a fire is hot, not because you have measured the temperature, but because you have watched what it does. He was a generous man, a warm man, a man with a large laugh and a larger heart, and none of it, not 1 ounce of it, translated into the ability to manage the estates, or honor his debts, or do anything practical in the world that did not involve being in her presence. When she died, he simply ceased to function, not dramatically. He didn't drink or rage or do anything that made a story. He just diminished, stopped caring about the land, stopped attending to his tenants, stopped noticing that his son was 17 and frightened, and increasingly responsible for keeping the whole construction from falling down. He followed her inside of a year. I do not say this without grief. I say it as a fact about the consequences of a particular kind of love, which is that it makes a man unable to be in the world without its object, and I had watched this carefully and decided very young that I would not be that man. I was good at decisions. I made this one at 17, and I kept it for 20 years. I kept it through a brief engagement in my late 20s that ended when the young woman quite sensibly chose a man who could be in the same room with her without an air of careful management, and I did not blame her. I kept it through 2 London seasons in which nothing happened, and 1 Yorkshire summer in which a widow of my acquaintance made her interest plain, and I thanked her with genuine warmth and absolute finality. I kept it consistently and well. And then I sat in my study in February in the dark, and understood that I had kept it for 20 years and it had availed me precisely nothing, because the thing I had been carefully preventing had happened anyway, quietly, over 6 years, in my own library without my consent, and the question was now what to do about it. The answer I arrived at in the dark was not a good answer. I know that. I knew it then. But it was the answer of a man who had built himself around a particular principle for 2 decades and could not, at 11 o'clock on a February night, locate an alternative. I would manage the situation. I would place it at the correct distance. And the first step was to place her at the correct distance. I wrote the letter to her cousin in Edinburgh the following week. Mrs. Halford of Canongate was a perfectly respectable woman, a widow, comfortable, intelligent, the wife of a former advocate. She had room in her household for a young companion, and she corresponded with me pleasantly about the arrangement. I drew up the terms. The quarterly allowance would continue, as arranged. Any material concern should be directed to Peel. I did not explain myself in the letter to Mrs. Halford, and I did not explain myself to Sarah. I asked Peel to speak to her about the travel arrangements. Peel came back and said that Miss Vane would like to speak with me directly if I was available. I told him I was available Thursday morning. She came on Thursday at 10. She stood in the doorway of the study. She always knocked on the open door, a formality she had invented herself at some early stage and maintained without my asking. And she was already dressed for travel, because she had understood, I think, that this was not a negotiation. She had dark eyes and she wore them steadily. I told her the arrangement with Mrs. Halford was a good opportunity. Edinburgh was an excellent city for a young woman of her mind and interests. The period would not exceed 2 years. She listened to all of this without moving. When I finished, she said, "Is this what you want, Aldrich?" She was the only person in Yorkshire who used my Christian name. She had done it since she was 14, and I had never corrected it, because I did not want to. "It is what I think best," I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "All right." And that was all. No argument, no accusation, no tears. I had half expected tears, which I was ashamed of afterward. It was not, I understood, the kind of response that was in her. She left the following Tuesday. She came to the study door at 8 in the morning in her traveling coat with her gloves already fastened and said, "The carriage is here. Goodbye, Your Grace." Your Grace. It was the first time in 5 years she had called me that. "Goodbye, Miss Vane," I said. "Safe journey." She went. I did not move from my desk for a considerable time. Eventually, I stood and went to the window that faces the front drive. The carriage was already at the far end of the lane, going toward the Aldwick Road. I watched it until the moor took it. Then I went back to my desk and opened the Hull accounts, and I worked for 4 hours without stopping, and I was entirely fine. This is what I told myself. The first letter I did not send was written 6 days after she left. I had found a note in the library, a small paper bookmark she had used and left behind, with a few words in her handwriting. The Fen Drainage chapter, page 211, Aldrich should read this. She wrote my name on things she meant to show me. She had been doing it for years. The books in the library had half a dozen of these markers in them, things she had flagged and then either shown me or not quite gotten around to. I sat in the library with this piece of paper for longer than was reasonable. Then I went to my study and wrote a letter to Edinburgh telling her that I had found the bookmark and that I had read page 211 and that she was right about the Fen drainage principle. It had an application to the Westfield situation that I hadn't considered. I wrote 2 pages. Then I folded the letter, sealed it, addressed it to Canongate, and put it in the top drawer of the desk. In the morning I told Peel there was no outgoing correspondence. I do not have a complete explanation for this. The partial explanation is that I had sent her to Edinburgh precisely in order to create a distance, and sending letters would not create a distance, it would only create the illusion of one. The partial explanation is also that the letter was, if I read it back, considerably more than a note about Fen drainage. And I was aware of this. and I was not ready to send something that was considerably more than a note about fen drainage to a young woman of 19 who had called me Your Grace on her way out the door, and deserved a great deal better than my confusion. The letters accumulated in the top drawer, not quickly, perhaps one a month, sometimes less, things I noticed. Things that would have been the kind of thing I brought her attention to, in the evenings in the library, in the years when she was in the East Wing, and the house had a different quality to it. I wrote about the Harker family's Westfield progress. I wrote about a book I found on the natural history of the Cleveland Hills that had a chapter she would have disagreed with. I wrote about a November storm that came off the moor with extraordinary force and took down 3 of the older oaks on the north boundary, and how the morning after, the light came across the cleared ground in a way I didn't have a word for, but thought she would. I sealed each one, addressed each one to Canongate, placed each one in the drawer. At the end of the first year, I had 11 letters in the drawer. At the end of the second year, 23. At the end of the third year, 31. The East Wing rooms I left as they were. Mrs. Dunlop asked in the second summer whether the second room might be converted to a linen store as it was wasted space. I said no. She said, "Yes, Your Grace," in the tone she used when she had expected that answer and was satisfied by it, and withdrew. The small watercolor of the moors was still on the wall beside the east window. Some mornings, going down the east corridor for no particular reason, I would stop and look at it. I administered the estate. I attended to my tenants. I discharged my obligations to the county and the title. I was, by every observable measure, entirely fine. The letter from Mrs. Dunlop arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd October, after the leaves had already come off the moorland rowans, and the first gray cold of the season had settled into the stones of the house. Mrs. Dunlop had received a letter from Mrs. Halford of Canongate, who had written to say that Miss Vane would be returning to Yorkshire the following week to attend to the remaining matters of her late father's estate, several items of which had been retained in the Thornmere archive for administrative reasons that had, Mrs. Halford's letter noted with a delicacy that suggested she had been well briefed, extended somewhat beyond their originally intended duration. I read this letter twice in the great hall while Mrs. Dunlop waited. Then I said, "Have the East Wing rooms prepared?" Mrs. Dunlop said, "Yes, Your Grace." The satisfaction in her voice was so well managed that I chose to ignore it. I called for Peel. I told him to review the Vane estate file and ensure the archive materials were fully documented and ready for the solicitor's review. He said he would see to it. He looked at me with his working assumption expression. She arrived on a Thursday, late in the afternoon. The moor had gone gray and flat in the way it goes in November, the light leaving early and without ceremony. I heard the carriage on the gravel. I was in the library with the Hull accounts in front of me, and I did not go to the front steps. Mrs. Dunlop met her. I could hear from 2 rooms away the warmth in Mrs. Dunlop's voice. Then Sira's voice, lower and steadier. Then a sound I identified after a moment of genuine uncertainty as Mrs. Dunlop weeping, which in 30 years I had never heard from her. I remained in the library. She came to find me at 6:30. She knocked on the open door, the same formality, still in place, and stood in the doorway in a gray wool traveling dress, her hair arranged somewhat more formally than the loose arrangement she had worn at 19, and looked at me with the dark eyes that had not changed by 1 degree. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Vane," I set down the accounts. "I trust the journey was tolerable." "Perfectly, thank you." A pause, small and level. "I've spoken to Peel about the archive. He suggests Tuesday would suit if that suits you." "Tuesday suits me perfectly." She nodded. "Good evening, then." "Good evening, Miss Vane." She left. I sat with the accounts in front of me for a long time, not reading them. She was at breakfast before me on Friday, which was a thing she had done since she was 14. I registered this before I registered anything else when I came into the dining room, The sight of her there, with a cup of tea, and the Harrogate Advertiser, and the slight crease between her brows that meant she was reading something she was not entirely in agreement with. She looked up when I came in. "Good morning, Your Grace." "Good morning." I poured coffee. After a moment I said, "You might call me Aldrich." She looked at me with an expression I could not read and said, "I might," and returned to the paper. I sat with this for a moment. The courtesy she had put on at the study door on departure morning, "Your Grace," precise and complete, was still in place, and she was not going to remove it unilaterally, which was correct. It was not hers to remove. I looked at my coffee. "How was Edinburgh?" I asked. "Very good for me," she said, turning a page. "Mrs. Halford's household is excellent company. Several of the advocates' wives have genuine minds." I took up French conversation again. "I visited the botanical gardens a good deal in the summers." She paused. "The moorling doesn't do well in Edinburgh, but the botanic garden has some moorland specimens they manage under glass. I found it," another pause, "somewhat melancholy, actually. Things maintained at a distance from the conditions that produced them." She turned another page. She did not look up. I said after a moment, "Were you happy?" The paper stilled. She looked up, and something moved in the dark eyes, not pain precisely, but its near neighbor, and then was gone, replaced by the steadiness she wore like good cloth. "I was occupied," she said. "I find I do well when I am occupied." I had given her the need to be occupied. I understood this, and she knew I understood it, and we both left it exactly where it was. The archive work began on Tuesday and ran through the following Thursday in the estate room, with Peel in attendance and Sira across the long table from me with her small leather notebook. The estate of Charles Vane, solicitor, had left behind a quantity of papers that my own solicitors had retained for reasons that had never been made inconvenient enough to resolve. There were land surveys of the Aldwych property, correspondence from the period of his employment, 3 boxes of documents relating to the Hull interest that should have been transferred within a year of his death, and had instead been sitting in the upper archive, labeled simply Vane, outstanding. She worked through everything with the same methodical attention she had brought to my study at 13 with her father's ledger. She made notes in the leather book. She asked Peel questions that were clear and specific, and twice left him with the look of a man who needed to verify his answer before giving it. She was not unkind about these silences. She thanked him when he produced what was needed. When he didn't, she simply noted it in her book and moved to the next item. On the second day, I found a surveying note in her father's handwriting that had been misfiled in a Thornmere General folder. It was nothing of legal significance. An old estimate of the Aldwych Field drainage, dated 1839, made before the drainage work was done. But it was in his hand, and I recognized the handwriting, and I watched her face when I passed it across the table. She took it without looking at me and read it. Her expression did not change, but she held it for an additional moment after she had finished, smoothing the fold with the tip of one finger before she placed it carefully in the folder. "Thank you," she said. "It isn't required for the settlement, but I'd like to keep it." "Of course," I said. She looked up. The steadiness was entirely intact. "He spoke well of you," she said. "My father often." A short pause. "I thought you should know that." I said he was a good man. "He was," she agreed and closed the folder. We did not speak again for an hour, but the quality of the silence was different than it had been. On Thursday afternoon, the 4th day of the archive work, Peel went to the upper archive for a particular folder, and I was alone with her at the long table. The October light was going gray at the windows. She was writing in the small leather book, and I was watching her hand move across the page, and I was thinking, quite clearly, in the manner of a man who has finished pretending to himself, that I had sent her away 3 years ago because she was the only thing in my world I was afraid of, and that the 3 years had not resolved this, and that I was still afraid, and that I was in the process of losing her again. Not dramatically, not with any scene, but simply through the slow motion of her completing this work and returning to Edinburgh, or wherever she intended next, composed and self-sufficient, and no longer needing anything from Thornmere Hall at all. "Sira," I said. She finished the words she was writing before she looked up. This had always been her way. "The East Wing rooms," I said. "Mrs. Dunlop wished to convert the second room while you were away. I asked her not to." She looked at me for a moment. "I didn't know that." "No, I didn't tell you." The steadiness was still in place, but there was something behind it, some awareness that the conversation had shifted from the estate papers. "Why are you telling me now?" "Because I am attempting to say something," I said, "and I find I am doing it badly, as usual, and going at it indirectly, as usual." I looked at the surface of the table. "I am trying to tell you that I did not put the rooms to other use because the possibility that you might," I stopped. I had spent 3 years writing letters that said this with complete clarity because they were never going to be read. And now that I was attempting to say it aloud with a person present, the facility entirely deserted me. Peel returned with the folder. She looked at me for one additional second, something careful and guarded in it, something that was not yet trust but was not hostility either, and then she turned to Peel and said, "Is the Kirkgate survey in that one?" It was. We worked for another hour. The conversation closed and did not reopen, and I told myself that was probably the correct outcome, and I did not believe this for a moment. The storm came on Saturday. It came off the moor in the manner of November storms in this part of Yorkshire, not announced, not gradual, simply present. By 3 o'clock the Aldwick Road was impractical. By 4, impractical had become impossible, and my other house guest, a Mr. Fenchurch from Leeds who had come about a property matter, and who had brought to the weekend exactly as much personality as was required for a property matter and no more, retreated with notable speed to his room, a decanter, and the wall-eyed certainty that none of this was his fault. Sira and I had supper together in the small dining room, which was warmer than the large one, and which we had always used in winter when there were no guests. She sat across from me and ate soup and asked Peel, when he came in to clear, whether the roads were likely to be passable by morning. Peel said he rather thought not before noon at the earliest. She nodded and thanked him. We went to the library afterward. The fire was very large. The wind was doing what November wind does to a Yorkshire house built 400 years ago, finding every opinion the Stones had about the matter and expressing them at length. I had a glass of port. She had a small glass of Madeira that she had been nursing since supper and was still nursing, which meant she was thinking. She always drank slowly when she was thinking. She was reading the Natural History of the Yorkshire Moors, a slim volume she had bought in the village. She had told me at supper, at the lending library. She had been to the lending library the previous afternoon, without mentioning she was going. I had looked up from the estate room window and seen her crossing the village lane in her grey wool coat, and I had stood at that window longer than was warranted. I was not reading. I had a paper in my hands that I had opened and turned twice and had read, in total, perhaps 40 words of. She put the book face down on her knee and looked at me directly, in the way she had always done, no preamble, no softening. "You're not reading," she said. "I am. You've been on the same page since we sat down." "That was 40 minutes ago." I closed the paper. "What chapter are you on?" "The drainage chapter." She tilted the cover toward me so I could read the spine. "There's a section on the Moor Fen system that you'd want to argue with." The corner of her mouth moved. "I thought of you immediately." The corner of her mouth. That particular movement, which was Sira Vane's version of warmth, not a smile exactly, more the suggestion that a smile was available, had the circumstances warranted. I had missed it so specifically and so continuously for 3 years that the sight of it in the library firelight produced, in my chest, something I could not have named with any precision. "Sierra," I said. "Aldrich," she said. My name and her voice in this room, after 3 years of your grace. The sound of it landed in the silence the way the first note of something lands when you've been waiting, without knowing you were waiting. "I owe you an explanation," I said. "You don't," she said, immediately and without particular force. "You owe me the signed transfer on the Kirkgate surveying files. Peel can arrange it Monday." She looked at the fire. "What happened was appropriate. You were my guardian and I was 19, and it was a reasonable decision." "It was not a reasonable decision," I said. "It was a frightened one." She turned her head and looked at me. The steadiness was still there, but she was listening in a different register now. "My father," I said, "was the most devoted man I have ever known. He loved my mother completely, entirely, without remainder. When she died, there was nothing left of him that functioned, not the estate, not his obligations, I stopped, not his son." I said this without bitterness. It was simply the fact. I watched that from close range for a year, and then he was gone as well, and I was 17, and I made a decision. I decided that love of that particular totality was not a virtue. It was an abdication, and I was going to be a man who did not abdicate. She was very still. "I kept that decision for 20 years, I said. "I was quite good at it. And then you were in my house for 6 years, and you were in every room, not intrusively, not asking for anything, simply present. And one evening in February, you were reading that Moore book, as it happens, the one you have now. I think you had a library copy. I looked up and understood that I had entirely failed. That you had become, without any adequate resistance on my part, the most necessary person in my life. And rather than examine what that meant, I wrote a letter to your cousin in Edinburgh and arranged for the situation to be administered." The fire said something, the storm answered. "I sent you away," I said, "because I was afraid of becoming my father. And it has taken me 3 years of a very quiet house to understand that what I actually became, by that logic, was something considerably worse." She was quiet for a long time. The Madeira glass was very still in her hand. "You kept the rooms," she said. "I kept the rooms." "And there was a letter," she said quietly, "in the East Wing desk, when I arrived, sealed in your hand, addressed to Canongate. It hadn't been sent." The library was warm. The port glass was smooth in my hand. I set it down. "There were a number of letters," I said. She looked at me. "How many?" I said nothing. "Aldrich," my name again, complete. "How many letters?" 31, I said. "Over 3 years. They are in the top drawer of the East Wing desk. I sealed each one and addressed it and did not send any of them." Something happened in her face, not tears, not drama, but the brightness that gathered in her eyes when she was working to keep something level. It was the brightest her eyes had ever been. 31 letters, she said. "I am aware that this is not a virtue. I am a man who can apparently express himself with complete clarity in a letter he has no intention of sending, and with almost no clarity whatsoever when the person is present. I have observed this quality in myself, and I find it deeply inconvenient." The corner of her mouth did the thing again, through the brightness. "What did you say?" she asked. "In them?" "Things I noticed. Things I would have told you if you'd been here. The Harker family's Westfield drainage finally coming right. A book on the Cleveland Hills with a chapter you would have argued with. A November storm that took down 3 oaks on the north boundary, and the way the light came across the gap the following morning." I looked at the fire. "That I missed you, which I wrote in approximately 14 different ways across 31 letters, and never managed to make sound adequate." I looked back at her. "That I was wrong to send you away without an explanation. That you deserved better than being managed. That I have been, in the 3 years since a Tuesday in March, more specifically and consciously lonely than I have been in my entire adult life, including the years when I was actively constructing the situation." She looked at me for a long time. "I am not my father," I said. Or, "I am trying not to be," and perhaps the better statement is that I understand now that the way not to be him is not to refuse everything, but to be more careful than he was about what I choose. He loved carelessly. I have refused carefully. Neither of these is the thing. I held her gaze. What I would like, what I am asking, without any claim of guardianship or rank or circumstance, is whether there is any possibility, whether 3 years of a Tuesday in March and 31 letters I couldn't send is something that can be answered, whether you would allow me to try. The storm pressed its long gray shoulder against the house. The candle on the small table between us bent and recovered. She set the book down. She set the Madeira glass down. She looked at me with the dark eyes and the brightness in them and the steadiness that had been there since she was 13 years old in a black morning dress, and she said, "The terms." "Whatever you require," I said. "I will not be managed," she said, quietly and without heat, each thing stated once as fact. "I will not be arranged at. I will not be sent somewhere without a reason. I will not be administered from a careful distance for my own good." She held my gaze. "And if you write me a letter you intend to send, you send it." "Yes," I said. "All of them," she said. I looked at her. "The 31, she said. "I would like to read them, eventually all of them." "They are in the desk," I said, "the East Wing desk." "I know where the desk is." The corner of her mouth again. "I know where everything in this house is." I stood. She stood at almost the same moment. She had always done this, never quite waiting to be helped up or invited, simply moving in her own time, which happened to be the same time. I crossed the 3 feet of library floor between us, and she did not step back. I took her left hand, the one that held the page, always the left one, and she was looking up at me with those dark eyes that had not changed in 3 years and were not changing now. "Sierra," I said. "Yes," she said. "The drainage chapter," I said. "The section on the fen system." A pause. "What about it?" "You said I'd want to argue with it." "You would," she said. "The author hasn't accounted for the seasonal water table variation above the limestone shelf. It's a significant omission." "I'll read it tonight," I said. "I know you will," she said. Her hand was in mine. The library was warm. The storm was doing what November storms do, and outside the windows the moor was doing what the moor does, which is to be entirely indifferent to everything that happens in houses and entirely present all the same. I had stood at the window of this library for 20 years and looked at it and found it fortifying. The way a man finds fortifying anything sufficiently larger than himself and older than his difficulty. Sierra Vane was, I thought, looking down at her in the firelight, also considerably larger than my difficulty. She had always been. I had simply been standing at the wrong window. We married in April. The ceremony was in the village church at Aldwyconmore, a small stone building that the Thornmere estate had maintained for 4 generations, with 12 pews and a window of indifferent colored glass that went extraordinary in the afternoon light. Mrs. Dunlop was there, which she had clearly been planning for some time, given the quality of her hat. Peel was there, with the expression of a man revising a long-standing working assumption and finding the revision satisfactory. 3 tenant families attended and brought, collectively, enough food for a wedding 4 times the size, which was exactly the kind of excess I would not have thought to arrange, and which made the whole thing better. She made the East Wing rooms into a study. Not immediately. She did other things first, including reading all 31 letters, which took her 2 evenings, and which she did in the East Wing armchair with the door closed, and which she never, in detail, described to me. She came out on the 2nd evening and said only that number 9 was her favorite, which was the one about the November storm and the oaks and the quality of the light on the cleared ground. I asked her why that one. She said because it was the one that was most completely not about drainage. She gave her opinion on the Southfield drainage, which she had inspected the week after she arrived, and noted 3 specific points of concern. She was right about all 3. I addressed them in May and she walked the field in June and said, without looking up from the puddle she was assessing with the toe of her boot, better. As though it had been a question I had been attempting to answer for some time, and the answer was now, provisionally, acceptable. She was right about the fin system chapter. The author had entirely failed to account for the seasonal water table variation above the limestone shelf, and when I read it that November night, sitting by the library fire after she had gone to bed with the 31 letters on the desk above her, I found myself talking back to the page in a way I had not talked to a book since she left. I told her so in the morning. She said she knew. I did not become my father. This is not entirely my doing. My father had no one to show him how to hold things without gripping them past their own capacity, how to love without consuming the entire available margin of judgment, how to be in a room with another person and find the silence useful rather than threatening. I had Sierra Vane for 6 years, and then 3 years of 31 letters, and then the rest of my life. She reads in the library in the evenings. I read across from her, or I pretend to read and watch the firelight on her face, and she knows when I am pretending and lets me. When she finds something interesting, she brings it to my attention without announcement, simply holds the page toward me or reads me a sentence, or leaves a bookmark on something she wants me to find, with my name on it in her handwriting. She has never called me Your Grace again. I was the most careful man in 3 counties. I had administered everything in my life with great efficiency and at a reliable distance, and I had been, in the ordinary daily sense that no one counts and no one measures, very quietly and consistently alone. And then she came back in a gray wool dress on a November Thursday with her gloves already fastened, and called me Your Grace with perfect courtesy, and did not cry, and did not make a scene, and sat across from me at the estate table, and worked through her father's papers with a small leather notebook, and the patience of someone who has learned to be self-sufficient because she had to be, and who has not, despite all evidence in favor of it, entirely given up on the man who made her need to be. That is the thing about Sierra Vane. She never required anything of me. She only ever brought me things she found interesting, and waited, with a patience considerably greater than I deserved, to see whether I would bring anything back. I kept 31 letters in a desk drawer for 3 years. She said number 9 was her favorite. I am working on number 32.